The wind moved slow and steady across the wide, empty plains of Montana, whispering through golden wheat stalks and over the weather-worn shingles of a lonesome cabin. Thomas Reed stood barefoot on the porch, a chipped mug of black coffee in his hands, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was falling, casting long shadows over the land he called home, land he'd worked alone for 12 years. At 32, Thomas was no longer young, though his face still held the softness of someone who hadn't been worn down by vice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like a man who'd lived with silence long enough to be comfortable in it. His voice was quiet, his hands rough, his heart untouched. He had never loved. Not really. Not beyond the loyal hound that had died the previous winter, or the mare that had carried him since he was 16. No woman had ever stayed long enough to warm his bed, let alone his life. He was polite to the girls in Bitter Ridge, but they laughed too loud and danced too fast. He never quite knew what to say, so he stopped trying. He'd made peace with it, or tried to. The days passed in rhythm. Milk the cow, fix the fence, eat, sleep, repeat. But sometimes, in the hush between supper and sundown, he felt a pull, something deep and aching. Not just for a woman, but for connection. Someone to see him. That's why, when he saw movement near the edge of his property, he didn't believe it at first. He squinted, placing the mug on the rail. A figure was walking across the field. Not a rider, not a settler's wagon. Just a lone traveler, moving slow but steady in the dimming light. Thomas grabbed his rifle. Habit. Not hostility, and stepped down from the porch. As the figure came closer, the shape became clearer. A woman. Slender, tall, her posture proud despite her evident exhaustion. Her dark hair was braided, falling down her back, and feathers were woven into the strands. She wore a beaded garment that had once been elegant but was now torn at the hem and stained with travel. She stopped a few yards away from him, breathing hard but not afraid. Thomas lowered the rifle. "You lost?" he asked gently. The woman shook her head. Her voice, when it came, was soft but firm. "No," he nodded. "Hungry?" A small pause. Then, "Yes," he gestured toward the porch. "You can rest here a while." "Got stew on the fire." The woman didn't move right away. Her dark eyes studied him, searching for judgment or deceit. She found none. Finally, she stepped forward. "I'm a yoka," she said. "I won't cause trouble." "I'm Thomas," he replied. "And you won't." They sat opposite each other inside the cabin as the fire cracked, and the last sliver of daylight vanished behind the hills. Ahyoka ate quietly but quickly, spooning the stew into her mouth like someone who hadn't eaten in days. Thomas said nothing, letting her take what she needed. After a time, she looked up. "This your land?" "It is." "You live here?" "Alone?" He nodded. 12 years now. Ahyoka's gaze drifted to the small pile of books on the shelf, the worn coat by the door, the framed sketch of an old couple above the hearth. No wife? Thomas shook his head. No one ever stayed. Ahyoka didn't smile, but her expression softened. "Strange. You don't seem cruel." "I'm not," Thomas said, his voice low. "Just quiet." They sat in silence for a while longer, firelight dancing across their faces. Outside, the wind picked up again, and an owl called out somewhere in the distance. Finally, Ahyoka spoke. "My people sent me away. Not for anything I did, just for being different." Thomas studied her, then quietly said, "You can stay here if you want. No expectations, just warmth, safety." Ahyoka met his gaze. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't look away either. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something, uncertain, fragile, but real. For the first time in a long while, Thomas didn't feel invisible. And Ahyoka didn't feel alone. The fire crackled. And the night, for once, felt less cold. Morning came slowly on the Montana frontier. The light was pale, brushing gold across the hills before it touched the worn edges of Thomas Reed's cabin. Inside, the embers in the hearth had died down to a soft glow. Thomas was already up, the smell of coffee filling the air, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and dew-damp earth. Ahyoka was still asleep on the cot near the window, his mother's old sewing bed. Long unused until last night. Thomas hadn't slept much, not because he was uneasy, but because her presence had changed the house. It wasn't just quiet now, it was shared. Every sound, the creak of the wood, the hiss of the kettle, felt new again, like he was hearing it for the first time. He glanced toward her as he poured coffee into a tin cup. Her face, relaxed in sleep, looked younger, but the faint lines around her mouth and eyes told stories of pain, resilience, and distance traveled. She wore the same beaded garment as yesterday, now covered with a blanket he'd draped over her once she fell asleep. As he stepped outside, the cold air bit at his skin. He sipped slowly, watching the sun pull itself over the hills, and tried to make sense of it all. He had no expectations when he let her in, only decency and instinct. But now she was here, a real person, a woman with no home, just like him. Behind him, the door creaked open. Ayoka stepped out into the light, arms crossed against the morning chill. She had tied her hair back, and though her clothes were travel-worn, her posture was still proud. Thomas turned. "Morning," she nodded. "Your land. It's quiet." He smiled faintly. "Some say it's lonely." "Lonely can be peaceful," she said, gazing out over the horizon. They stood in silence, the way people do when words aren't necessary. Then she asked, "Why did you stay here all these years all alone?" Thomas exhaled. "I suppose it's all I knew. Parents passed when I was 19. Never had kin to go to. This land was theirs and it became mine." Ayoka studied him. "No wife, no children?" He shook his head. "Never had the nerve. Didn't know how to talk to women. Didn't think I had much to offer." She looked at him differently then, not with pity, but with understanding. "Where I come from," she said quietly, "men are expected to be warriors. Loud, fierce. You're not like that." Thomas looked at her, meeting her gaze evenly. "Would that be better?" "No," she said simply. He nodded, as if they'd agreed on something important without quite knowing what. Inside the cabin, he gave her time to wash and offered her clean clothes. His mother's old work dress kept in a trunk under the bed. When she emerged from the back room wearing it, the moment hit him harder than he expected. The dress fit imperfectly, but it softened her. She looked more like someone meant to stay, and less like someone passing through. "I can work," she said, almost defensively. "I'm strong. I've hunted, cooked, skinned deer. I can make bread. I can stitch and clean wounds." Thomas blinked, unsure why she felt she had to prove herself. "Ayoka," he said gently, "you don't have to earn your place here." "Not with me." She looked at him carefully. "Then why did you let me stay?" He paused before answering. "Because I know what it feels like to have nowhere else to go." Her jaw tightened slightly, emotion flickering behind her eyes. She sat down at the table and traced her fingers over the rough wood. "I don't want to leave," she admitted. "But I also don't want to be a burden." Thomas sat across from her, folding his hands. "Then we work this land together. As long as you want to stay." There was a long silence between them, but it was warm, not strained. A kind of agreement passed between them, unspoken, but true. Ayoka rose slowly and looked out the window. "Your land is wide," she murmured. "Wider than anything I've ever known." Thomas stood beside her. "So's the heart, if you let it be." Outside, smoke curled from the chimney and drifted into the morning sky, a sign that for the first time in years, the cabin was alive with something more than habit. It was hope. The days grew longer as spring crept over the Montana plains. Each morning began the same, Thomas rising before dawn to tend the livestock, Ayoka grinding corn or sweeping the porch, her long black hair catching the sun like flowing ink. They didn't speak much at first. Each carried the weight of solitude in their own way. But slowly, something unspoken settled between them. A rhythm, a shared silence that no longer felt empty. One evening, as the wind howled low across the hills and the sun slipped behind the ridges, Thomas lit a fire in the hearth and invited Ayoka to sit. "You've been here near 3 weeks," he said, handing her a mug of tea. "Reckon I still don't know your story." She stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "I was promised to a man in my tribe," she said quietly. "A warrior. Respected. Strong. But he saw women as things to control. I refused. The elder said I was dishonoring tradition. I chose exile over chains." Thomas didn't interrupt. He just listened, his eyes steady. "I walked for days," she continued. "Nights were colder than anything I'd ever felt. I thought the wind would bury me in the snow. And then I saw your chimney smoke." She glanced at him. "I thought maybe that was a sign. That somewhere someone still had a fire burning." Thomas looked into his cup, unsure what to say. Then softly, "You kept walking even when it got cold." Ahyoka nodded. "That's brave," he added. She smiled faintly. "No braver than living out here alone for years." They shared a quiet laugh, soft, unsure, but real. Later that night, Thomas retrieved something from a carved wooden box near his bed. It was a bundle of folded papers, letters he'd written but never sent. "I used to write to people," he confessed. "Neighbors, sometimes even a cousin out east. I'd describe the weather, the work. Pretend like someone might write back." Ahyoka looked at the worn creases in the paper, the faded ink. "Did they ever?" He shook his head. "Didn't matter. Made the nights feel less hollow." She touched the edge of one letter and smiled. "You should keep writing." "To who?" Ahyoka met his eyes. "To me. Even if I'm right here." Something in that moment changed the air between them. Not desire, not yet. But recognition. Trust. Later, as Ahyoka laid on the cot, her voice cut gently through the dark. "Do you think people like us can start over?" Thomas, sitting in his chair near the fire, responded without hesitation. "I think we already have." The days that followed were different. They began planting spring wheat, sowing the earth side by side. Thomas showed her how to repair the chicken coop, and Ahyoka taught him how to trap and dry meat in a way that lasted longer through the summer. She laughed more now. And Thomas smiled more than he had in years, not because they were falling in love, at least not yet, but because they were learning how to live again, together. One evening, they sat under the stars, the fire crackling between them. Ahyoka plucked a tune on a small handmade flute she'd carved during the long afternoons. The melody drifted like wind through grass, haunting, lovely, and wild. Thomas leaned back against the cabin wall. "What's the song about?" She paused. "It's about someone who was lost in the woods, but they heard a voice in the wind and followed it home." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fire flickered. Stars wheeled overhead. And for the first time in either of their lives, the world felt vast, but not empty. The Montana sky was a strange thing, vast and endless, but always threatening to turn. One minute it was clear, stretching blue and calm from ridge to ridge. The next, it shifted like a wounded animal, darkening with thunderclouds that rolled in like an army on horseback. Thomas had seen many storms, but this one was different. It had a wild smell to it, heavy and charged, as if the land itself was warning them to take cover. He was in the barn, securing the cattle, when the first rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. Ahyoka was in the field gathering kindling when the wind suddenly howled, scattering dust and leaves like spirits fleeing the earth. Thomas ran outside, yelling over the wind. "Ahyoka!" She was already hurrying toward the cabin, arms full, her braid whipping in the wind like a black flag. They reached the porch together just as the sky opened. The rain fell sideways, sheets of it, the kind of rain that pounded the soul and shook the walls. Inside the cabin, the fire hissed and flared, and the storm beat against the roof like hooves. Ahyoka stood by the window, staring out into the dark, her face unreadable. "You've seen storms like this?" Thomas asked, drying his hands with a cloth. She nodded slowly. "Yes, but not since I was a child." He watched her closely. There was something in her expression, far away, haunted. Bad memories? She didn't speak for a long time. Then quietly, "My mother died during one." Thomas's heart sank. "I'm sorry." Ahyoka closed her eyes. "We were caught too far from the village. Lightning hit a tree near the river. It split in half and fell on our shelter. I lived. She didn't. Thomas stepped forward but didn't touch her. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I do, she said softly. Because I never got to before, she turned to him. Grief makes people silence you. Or they just want you to be done with it. But sometimes you carry it like a storm that never ends. He nodded. I know that storm. They stood there, two orphans of grief, watching the sky fall apart. When lightning struck the field beyond the ridge, the flash illuminated the entire cabin. And in that brief light, Thomas saw Ayoka trembling. Without thinking, he stepped forward and reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. I'm here, he said gently. They sat on the floor near the fire after that, wrapped in an old quilt, their shoulders touching but not clinging. Ayoka rested her head on his arm. Not in passion, but in the kind of closeness that says you are not alone anymore. For a long time, they said nothing. Outside, the world raged. But inside that little cabin, something powerful had taken root. Trust, born not from words, but from the spaces between them. The morning after, everything had changed. The storm had passed, leaving the air clear and damp, the fields slick with mud and broken branches. Chickens wandered wide-eyed, and the creek near the back of the property had risen dangerously close to the fence line. Thomas and Ayoka worked side by side to clear the debris. Their hands were busy, but their glances were different, softer, deeper. At one point, Thomas reached for a fallen beam and winced. You're hurt, she said quickly, setting down her bundle. It's just my shoulder. Pulled it trying to wrestle the damn door closed last night? Let me see. He hesitated. I've treated worse, she added. Inside, Ayoka helped him remove his shirt, her fingers careful and clinical. But there was an undeniable tension in the air now, a fragile thread stretched tight between them. Not broken, she murmured, pressing her fingers into the muscle. Just strained. Thomas watched her, his breath shallow. She was close, so close. He could smell the cedar oil in her hair and see the faint scar on her jaw. Thank you, he whispered. Her eyes met his. For what? For staying, she paused. Then said something that broke the quiet like thunder. I don't want to leave. The words hung between them like a promise. Thomas reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then don't. That night, there was no storm outside. But something stirred between them inside. Not the storm of grief. Not of fear, but of something blooming, slow, tender, and terrifying in its honesty. The fire crackled softly that night. It wasn't just warmth. It was the only sound in the room, apart from the occasional whistle of wind through the gaps in the old cabin walls. Thomas sat at the edge of the hearth, rubbing his shoulder absently. Across from him, Ayoka worked a thread through a tear in one of his shirts, neatly, methodically, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her hands were calloused, skilled, the kind of hands that knew labor and pain and didn't flinch from either. Thomas watched her, stealing glances like a boy too shy to speak his mind. She looked up suddenly and caught him staring. What? He swallowed. Nothing. Just not used to someone else sitting in that chair. She set the shirt down in her lap. And now? He met her gaze, uncertain at first, then more grounded. Now I can't picture it empty again. The air between them shifted, soft, charged, delicate. Ayoka didn't smile. Not quite. But her eyes softened in a way that said she understood more than words could say. She stood and walked over to the hearth, sitting down beside him. You said you've never been with a woman, she said gently, voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire. Thomas blinked. Her directness wasn't harsh. It was sincere, thoughtful. But it still caught him off guard. I haven't, he admitted after a moment. Not out of religion or pride. Just, I never had the chance. And I guess I figured if it ever happened, it'd be with someone who saw me. Not just my land or what I could offer. He rubbed his palms together. Didn't think I'd live long enough for that. Ayoka turned toward him, her face unreadable. And now, he looked at her slowly. Now I see someone sitting by this fire who makes the whole world feel smaller. Quieter, better. Her breath caught. Just a fraction. I've never known a man who wasn't trying to take something from me, she said. Or prove something. You're different, Thomas. I don't know how to be anything else. That's what I mean, she whispered. There was a long silence. Not uncomfortable. Just full. And then quietly, Ayoka asked, "Can I show you something?" He nodded. She took his hand in hers, rough palms meeting calloused fingers, and gently pressed it against her cheek. Thomas's heart stumbled. "I'm not asking for anything tonight," she said. "Not promises, not plans. I just want to sit by this fire, beside someone I don't have to run from." He held her gaze, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "You're safe here, always." They sat that way for a long time, closer than they'd ever been, yet not needing to go further. The firelight danced across their faces, two shadows on the wall now joined by a third, something invisible but real. The days that followed were brighter. The land seemed to reflect their slow-growing bond, buds beginning to open on the prairie flowers, bird song trickling back into the trees. Even the wind felt softer, as if the earth itself had exhaled. They worked the fields side by side. Showed him how to twist willow bark for snares. He taught her how to mend fences and break colts. They shared food, laughter, stories of childhoods long gone, and every night they returned to that same firelight, talking less but feeling more. One night, as the sun bled red over the ridge, Thomas pulled a small carving from his pocket. A horse, clumsy but honest, hand-whittled from a scrap of pine. "I made this," he said awkwardly. "Figured it ain't much, but I wanted you to have something that came from here. From me." Ayoka took it gently, studying the crooked legs, the chipped ear. "It's beautiful," she said. He chuckled. "It's awful." "No," she said firmly, holding it to her chest. "It's the first thing anyone's given me that wasn't meant to buy or bind me." And then, for the first time since she'd arrived, Ayoka leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. Not a kiss. Something older, more sacred. Thomas closed his eyes, breathing her in, the scent of earth and wood smoke and wild wind, and felt something inside him change. He didn't know if it was love yet, but it was the beginning of it. And for a man who had known only silence for so long, that was everything. The land was quiet that morning, too quiet, the kind of stillness that settles before something changes. Thomas felt it in his bones as he looked out over the field from the porch. Ayoka was down by the creek, washing clothes, the morning sun, caught in her hair, and for a moment she looked like part of the earth itself, untamed, eternal, and beautiful beyond words. But something in her posture made his chest tighten. Her movements were slower, thoughtful. And when she turned and caught him watching, she didn't smile the way she usually did. She was thinking. She was deciding. Later, over coffee, she finally spoke. "I've been here almost 2 months," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes, "and I've felt more human here than I ever have. But part of me still wonders if I'm meant to stay." Thomas set his mug down, hands suddenly cold. "You're thinking of leaving?" "I don't want to," she said quickly. "But I've lived my whole life being told what I could and couldn't do, where I could stand, who I had to obey. You gave me space to breathe, Thomas. I don't want to turn this into another kind of cage." He looked at her, heart pounding. "I don't want you to stay because you feel safe. I want you to stay because you want to be here. Because maybe we make each other better." Ayoka stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the open land. "You're a good man. The best I've known. And if I do stay, I want it to be for us. Not out of fear or habit, but because it's right." There was a long silence. Only the ticking of the old wall clock marked the passing of time. Then, Thomas rose from his chair and walked to the small cupboard. He pulled out a worn leather pouch, opened it, and held out a delicate silver bracelet, embossed with a faint horsehair design, carefully tooled by his own hands. "I was saving this," he said, voice low. "Not for marriage. Not yet. Just for a moment like this? A choice." Ayoka stared at it, unmoving. He didn't place it on her wrist. He held it open in his palm, waiting. Finally, she stepped forward, slowly, and closed his fingers around it. "I'm not ready to be someone's wife," she said. "Not today. But I'm ready to be yours." Thomas's throat tightened. He nodded, eyes wet. "That's all I need." That evening, they took the horses out beyond the ridge. The sky was on fire, brilliant oranges and deep indigos streaked with clouds. Thomas pointed out the spot he was saving to build a second cabin. For her. If she ever wanted it. But Ayoka shook her head, smiling. "We don't need 2 roofs," she said. "One fire is enough." They rode in silence after that, letting the wind braid their hair and the fading sun paint them gold. There was no proposal, no kiss under the stars, just hands brushing, reins shared, and hearts opening wide under the sky. They returned home in the dark, but something had changed. Not who they were, but what they were becoming. 1 year later, the old cabin had a new roof, a new porch swing, a garden full of sunflowers Ayoka planted herself. Neighbors had started to stop by more often. Some still whispered when they saw her, still judged what they couldn't understand. But most came to respect her, to admire her strength, and to envy the calm she carried in her eyes. Thomas no longer wrote unsent letters. He had someone to talk to now, someone who didn't just listen, but heard him, and every night, as the fire flickered low and the chickens cooed outside, Ayoka would rest her head on his shoulder and whisper, "Still here." He would smile and reply, "So am I."